Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the American Academy in Berlin, it is my true honor and great pleasure to welcome you to the inauguration of the Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship and to the residency of Kerry James Marshall. And Kerry is here, and he'll be more here in a minute or two. The Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship will continue to bring the most distinguished visual artists from the United States for interaction with students, the art world, and the public in Berlin. The program exemplifies not only what Max Beckmann was about, but what the American Academy is about, the essential importance of transatlantic relations and of education for the curation and sustainability of knowledge and creativity for the 21st century and beyond. The program would never have been possible without the support of dedicated friends of the American Academy. And we'd like especially to recognize Mary Ellen Schacki-Schulz and Bernd Schulz, as well as Bernd's team, including Michaela Kapitsky at Griesebach, who set things in motion by hosting an auction to help fund the Beckmann Visitorship. Max Beckmann's granddaughter, Mayan, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, supported us with most valuable advice and insights. And of course, the entrepreneurial creativity of the Academy's founding executive director, Gary Smith, has been essential from the start. It is also a pleasure to recognize key supporters of this initiative who are here with us tonight. And these include Rudolf Borkenhagen, Bruno Brunet and Nicole Hackert, Ralf Echtler, Mitch Epstein, Ulrich Gebauer and Marie-Blanche Carrier, Hans Michael and Almut Gießen, Klaus and Lilly Heiliger, Alexis von Hönsbruch, Erika Hoffmann, Martin Klosterfelder, Renate Küchler, Achim Möller, Alexander Ochs, Jan Oehlmann, Arend und Brigitte Oetker, Klaus and Gesa Vogt, and Barbara Zumbaum. Kerry James Marshall was born in Alabama in 1955 and grew up in the Watts neighborhood of South Los Angeles. He graduated from the Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles in 1978. "You can't be born in Birmingham, Alabama," he said in a 2016 public television profile, "grow up in South Central near the Black Panthers headquarters and not feel like you've got some kind of social responsibility. You can't move to Watts in 1963 and not speak about it. That determined a lot of where my work was going to go." When Kerry reflected on his work last Friday in this room to a group of students from the UDK, the Freie Universität, and Bard College Berlin, he spoke in similar terms of the responsibility of artists to know the history of art. "You can't not know," he insisted, in what for me has become a kind of leitmotif of his practice, whether the reference is the history of painting or the legacy of social injustice. And Kerry, I just want to tell you, I think of myself as an honest scholar, so I will credit you, but I do intend to adopt that as a kind of motto, because it says so much with such efficiency. As you know, Kerry comes to Berlin on the heels of the Los Angeles opening of his major retrospective Mastery, following triumphant runs in Chicago and New York. The exhibition affirms his career-long conversation with the history of Western painting, into which he inserts the previously absent figures of the Black body and Black experience. The way Kerry negotiates absence, I would like to think, opens as well an uncannily precise conversation with this city, with the topography and culture of contemporary Berlin. Absence is usually associated with loss, and the topography of Berlin remains transparent in its record of loss and absence. But absence, and especially Kerry's depictions of absence, is also about possibility, emergence, about the not yet of history, and for this reason about the insistence on visibility and on seeing the truth of the past alongside the possibilities of the future. I think this is one of the reasons why a Marshall canvas offers us so unique a combination of truth and joy. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was first introduced as the next president of the American Academy, I remarked first that Gerhard Casper would be a very hard act to follow. Tonight, I'm delighted to confess that Gerhard is also a hard act to precede. but I do happily cede the floor to him, in any case, for an account of how he brought Kerry James Marshall to us at the American Academy, for which we are all profoundly in his debt. Gerhard.
So I want to tell you the story about how I invited Kerry James Marshall. The director of the Berlinische Galerie should be here. Is he here? Yeah, right? No, he was on the guest list. A year ago, when I served as president of the American Academy on an interim basis, there was at the Berlinische Galerie an exhibition of Max Beckmann and Berlin that Regina and I attended. It may have been that visit that nudged me into action. More likely, though, much more likely, it was gentle pressure from Bernd Schulz, the founder of Villa Griesebach, who happens to be our Dahlem landlord. Regina and I live there under the attic in the Schulz's villa. And who, with the support of Max Beckmann's granddaughter, Marion Beckmann, had enthusiastically embraced and furthered Gary Smith's proposal for the Distinguished Visitorship. I very strongly believe that these three, Gary, Bernd, and Marion Beckmann, were, to employ the somewhat unusual plural of a Latin expression, the spiritus rectores of the Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship. A rector, I've just made you a rector. An admirer of Max Beckmann, at least Regina and I, have been able to afford one Beckmann dry point from 1922 that we bought many years ago at a Griesebach auction. An admirer of Beckmann, I decided that we needed a truly distinguished American artist soon. I began to consult, and I assembled very plausible names in terms of distinction. However, many of these names made me uncomfortable. I'm not going to list them. As is evident from Beckmann's work, and as was strongly expressed by Marion Beckmann, abstract art never interested Beckmann. I quote Marion, "What interested him was the human being, was space, and of course, history and stories and fortunes." I decided to turn to advice on a more figurative artist, to Elizabeth Glassman, the president of the Terra Foundation for American Art in Chicago. Among the positions I've held in public life has been one that was truly pleasurable. Now, Liz should understand that I mean, Liz will immediately say, I didn't tell her at every board meeting that it was pleasurable. But a truly pleasurable position. Until last fall, I was the chairman of the Terra Foundation's board. And you can, of course, guess whom Liz suggested, Kerry James Marshall. Now, Liz came not all the way from Chicago to be here tonight, but she came all the way from Paris to be here and will return to Chicago from here. And we are just delighted to have you, Liz. She is the sine qua non of the Marshall presence. How often have you been told that you are a sine qua non? The recommendation, now we turn to you, Kerry. The recommendation made, of course, immediate sense. A truly great American painter who shares with Beckmann the interest in human beings and space, in history and social dynamics, and in stories and fortunes. Both painters are deeply read. Equally important, both painters have been influenced by the old masters. From the Renaissance, with regard to Kerry, Giotto, and Botticelli, to Rembrandt and onward. And Seurat, Kerry mentioned a couple of days ago. And the works of both Beckmann and Marshall reflect a concern with the perversions of political and social life. In the case of Beckmann, the decline of Weimar and then the Nazis. In the case of Marshall, racism and the fact, to use a contemporary expression, that Black lives matter. Randy Kennedy wrote recently in the New York Times, I quote, "Mr. Marshall has no assistant and answers all his own emails and phone calls, making getting in touch with him is sometimes tricky business." My letter of invitation to Mr. Marshall, or as we have all learned to call him Kerry, my letter of invitation to Kerry was dated April 21, 2016. Only and exactly 1 year later, on April 21, 2017, Kerry arrived at the Villa Arnold. I am delighted.
So it's my turn now. Oh, well, so welcome, and thank you all for coming out. I'm looking around, I see old friends and new friends and some great supporters of mine in the room. When I was in Chicago, I taught for about 11 or 12 years at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And just before I got there, Arturo Herrera, who's an artist who lives here in Berlin now, was a graduate student at UIC. And we've sort of known each other sort of since then. And we have some mutual friends in common who also went to school at UIC, one of whom is having a show open on Friday. So you're going to Carlos. The commander, Angela Chun from David Werner Gallery is here. Good to see you. Thank you. And Liz and I kind of go back a ways because the Terra Foundation also runs a scholars residency program at Giverny in France at the Monet compound. And my wife and I had the pleasure of spending about 5 weeks at Giverny once, how many years ago now? It was a while ago. And so Liz is not only the sine qua non, but she is also a great benefactor of mine. And as long as I stay in her good graces, I think I can punch my travel ticket to a lot of places around the world. But I mean, it really is great to be back in Berlin again. I was in Berlin first about 20 years ago or so as a part of an exhibition project that had this sort of a dual aspect, a show called Correspondences, and there were 5 artists from Germany and 5 artists from Chicago in an exhibition called Correspondences, and we had that show at the Martin Gropius Bau here. That was in 1994, 95 or something like that. It was quite a while ago. So that was the first time I'd been in Germany, first time in Berlin. Subsequently, I've been to Germany more than a few times. I've been in Documenta twice. I've gotten a painting that's sort of in the Ludwig collection because I was given the Wolfgang Hahn Prize. So I've gotten around the country a little bit. And my German is not so good because the last time I took a German class in school was almost 40 years ago. And so I'm not going to make the JFK mistake and tell you that I'm a sausage. By trying out my German on you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Casper. David. Gerhard. See, I'll get it right sooner or later. But thank you so much for the invitation. And it really has been a pleasure so far being here at the Academy. You know, the grounds are fabulous. The apartment is luxurious. The food is exquisite, you know. And the people you meet here are really, really at the top of the game when it comes to scholarship. I actually happened to run into another artist that I knew from the States who is a fellow here and has been here since January. Trenton Doyle Hancock is a fellow in here. I saw him on the street yesterday as I was riding a bicycle by. So it's amazing how you can go halfway around the world, and when you go, you always run into people you know, you know, which makes you feel most at home. And I do feel really quite at home here at the Academy. And so thank you all. My guide and savior, Barrett, has made everything so easy to be here, and has been a great companion as we've sort of driven around and gone to museums and looked at the hippest neighborhoods in Berlin, so, which of course she knows. So now I'm on a strict timeline. She's looking away now, but I know I have to get through, and I can go on for a long time, and I have a lot of things to show, and I'm going to show most of them without saying anything about it. But I like to start, when I start most of the talks I do, I always like to start with some a reading selection that puts everything in context and functions as a kind of backdrop against which the work that I show you will kind of stand out in sharper relief. And some of what the piece that I'm going to read from before I start now is actually also from a German favorite son, I guess, Benjamin Buchloh. I guess everybody likes him. But he's a hard man to negotiate because he is ruthless in his critique and assessment of what artists are up to. Especially in this moment. And this piece that I read, I first encountered, it was in a selection he did in Art Forum magazine back in 2005. And I think when I read it, it was an assessment of the reopening of MoMA, Museum of Modern Arts' collection after they had done a big expansion. But when I read his assessment of the reinstallation of the collection, I had never read anything like it before because it was so brutal and sort of unrelenting. But there was something also appealing about it to me because I think it really stated clearly what the challenges of making art in the contemporary moment are relative to the kind of history of art that we all have invested ourselves in. And so I'm gonna this part of it, and it's a really long thing, but there's this one section that nearly took the top of my head off. And so I'm gonna read it to you, after which you might wonder, why would anybody who is invested in making art like you are be so interested in something that was so savage? A critique of the enterprise. And I'll tell you why after. So this is I'm going to pick up where he had already sort of gone through his ideas about history and art and the modern collection at MoMA. But he gets to this place about the contemporary art in MoMA's collection. And so he starts like this. He says, if artworks in the contemporary galleries have not yet acquired the cult status of the multi-million-dollar object, pity is the appropriate term for them. In part because they reflect the naive confidence of their makers and in an art world apparatus and museum institution that they apparently plan to inhabit as though times had not changed, and as though their privileged status as makers of modern art remains unconditionally guaranteed. Pity is also appropriate in response to the attempts by these artists to prolong the agony, to extend the lineage of painting and sculpture at least by an inch in endless epigonal maneuvers. In fact, MoMA's contemporary collection makes it painfully clear that not only the social character of the artist seems to suffer from a failure of nerves, but curators, collectors, and spectators alike appear equally desperate to hold on to a kind of object production whose time has come and gone long ago. Whew. Now, I mean, you could probably make a case that there's something a little sadistic and a little masochistic about a person who would spend any time sort of reading and then rereading something like that. But the thing that interests me about it, and the reason why that kind of hostility works for me, is because on some level, I'm interested in the things that impose the most pressure on your ability to continue doing the thing that you claim to like to do. Because there is a way in which you can become so in love with your activity that you ignore sometimes the shifting changes of ideas and or feelings about the discipline. And there's a way in which you can sort of blindly continue to do things that on some level should be set aside or should have been set aside long ago. So I'm interested in the kinds of things that put the most pressure on me to continue doing what I want to do. And that pressure sort of started for me when I was in school. So I was in school in the mid-70s. And if everybody who knows anything about art history from the mid-70s, you know for sure that the whole idea of making paintings was pretty much considered retrograde. And that while I was in school then, the great thing about that moment, though, was that there seemed to be a lot at stake. And so there were literally pitched battles going back and forth between different factions in the school, with one group declaring that whatever it was you were doing was obsolete, and the other group sort of trying to find some way to marshal enough confidence in what they were doing to defend it and declare that there was still some value to be had. And so that's the environment that I came out of. So conceptual art had, by that time, completely taken over the academy. There was a faction of faculty and students who were actively trying to eliminate everybody who knew how to draw, everybody who knew how to paint, anybody who knew how to do sculpture, all of that. That was all going out the door. And so there were literally fights in the school. And there was a moment in which an exhibition was put up in the student gallery on campus. I had happened to become the student body president at that time. And when we came back to school after summer vacation, a number of the other graduate students in other departments asked if the show that was up had been up since the spring and into the summer. It stayed up over the summer, and then it was still there when the semester started. And some of the other graduate students asked me if we could take that show down and put up an exhibition that reflected the kind of work that everybody who was in the school was engaged in. And well, that seemed fair enough to me. And to be, as the student body president, and to be diplomatic about the whole thing, I went around to everybody who had work that was in the show that was there and asked them if they would have a problem if we took down that show and put up an exhibition that everybody else could participate in. And they all agreed. But the two guys who were students who ran the gallery, when they came back from vacation in Mexico 2 weeks late, school was already in, were livid, pissed off. And then a terrorist organization arose on campus called the Bagheads. And one day, this was in the early days of video and everything, and so they had the people running around with porta packs, shooting video, and they were doing a video news on campus. And there was one day this group called the Bagheads went into the gallery to take down the show that I had put up with everybody else who was on campus. And while they were being interviewed on the kind of Otis Art News channel, they were saying, well, that I had taken an authoritarian position, and they was called me Idi Amin. And they say, if Kerry James Marshall could take down a show, the Bagheads could take down a show. And so that says something about what seemed to be at stake at the time. And when the guys who were running the gallery came back, I went to have a meeting with them. And when I walked in the door, they had a pile of all the documents that were devoted to the running of the gallery and everything. And they just dropped the pile in front of me on the floor. And their position was, we were trying to run the gallery like a professional, intelligent art gallery. But if you want to have a gallery that puts up shows with paintings and sculptures, stuff like that, you can have it all. We don't want to have anything to do with it. That's what the climate was like. And so you can imagine sort of coming out of an environment like that. Well, how are you going to come out of an environment like that making paintings? But for me, in that moment, and in regards to the way Benjamin Buclot writes about the failure of nerve, there's still that space that he talked about, those endless epigonal maneuvers, so just trying to advance the practice of painting and sculpture by an inch. That's an indication that there's actually still some work that needs to be done, because the work that had been done before hadn't accomplished everything that needed to be done. And so knowing that, or believing that, those are the things that sort of bolstered my confidence in the fact that there was still something that was worthwhile left to be done, and it could be done with painting. But at the same time, I was very clearly aware of the fact that you can't just concentrate on one thing, that there was something about the entire enterprise of making art that was really important and that had to be contended with, and that I had to be as confident in my understanding of the way those things worked as everything else. So I always knew that I could always go back to doing any of the other things that I needed to do. But there was a problem with painting, and the problem with painting is temporal. The amount of time it often takes in order to do it. Not only the time it takes to do it, but the time it takes to learn how to do it well. And so I was committed to knowing how to do that well before I could move on to anything else, because all of that stuff was already in play. And so that's what I did. And that thing that I did had everything to do with whether or not I was going to be able to become a part of this museum establishment that Buclot seemed so critical of. And my interest was that there was a need to address this absence, this lack that Michael mentioned in his remarks. And that superseded anything else. That if that problem didn't get resolved, then there were a whole series of other problems that would be more intractable. And so I set myself the challenge of really trying to resolve this problem of presence in the museum, and to resolve it in a way where the centrality of this figure as a Black subject was undeniable. So this painting ended up being the key to the foundation of my entire practice as an artist. I mean, this is the thing that started it all. So before that, I was doing some other things. But I'm going to move past this quickly. So these are really early. But this painting and this painting. Now, this painting was the very first painting of mine that was purchased by a major museum in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Art Museum bought that painting. And once that painting had been bought, I had fulfilled a lot of my ambition of what I was aiming to do to be an artist. That was the painting that marked my entry. And it also marked a kind of maturity in my work. Because from that first Black painting, I'll go back. That painting is the painting that sort of embodied everything I felt like I had learned from reading the art historical record, looking at the work of Leonardo da Vinci, looking at the work of Michelangelo, looking at Raphael, looking at all that work. All of that stuff that I learned, I put in that painting. I put it in there, and it doesn't look anything at all like a Leonardo da Vinci painting. But there's something about the self-consciousness and the way of thinking and the way it's structured that participated in the dialogue and in the conversation with the way those paintings that Rembrandt and that Da Vinci and that Michelangelo were doing, the way those paintings were structured. It's the way they were built. And that painting is built exactly the same way those are built, with the same kind of self-consciousness and using the same kinds of classical sort of schematic grids and graphs and angles that those paintings are built on. That's the one when I did that painting, I understood what it was like to make paintings like those. And then I made these paintings. But this painting and this painting, these are both paintings that are owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This was the first painting that the Museum of Modern Art of mine bought. Now, thankfully, this was well after Bouckault had written his remarks on MoMA, so he wasn't talking about me when he was talking about it, when he was talking about everybody else. So I escaped the hatchet job. But anyway, but the thing is, like, the presence of these paintings in the Museum of Modern Art matters. And the thing is that for me, the reason they matter is because they are not about to close down the Museum of Modern Art. They're not going to dispose of all that work that's in there. That history is well established, and it will probably continue long after we are here. And if in the museum there are not images like these available to people to use in a curatorial scheme, or to be seen by visitors who come there, then the project fails. It only succeeds because this work is there. That it can be seen, and that when you go to the Museum of Modern Art, you can't not expect to see a work like that the moment after a work like that arrives in the museum's collection. It will always be a part of your understanding of what kinds of things belong in a place like the Museum of Modern Art, or belong in a place like the LA County Art Museum, or belong in a place like the Art Institute of Chicago. This is the thing that matters. And so this is the work that matters when you're working in the gap, where so much seems to already have been done that it seems like there's nothing left to do. Well, there is still something left to do. And one of the things that's left to do is for work that like this to enter into that space, but to enter into that space with a kind of self-consciousness that demonstrates that this is not something that's sort of happening as a natural phenomena. It's something that happens as a part of an intellectual engagement with the whole history of art making. That's what the whole project is about. And so when I'm going to show a lot of things, and you're going to see a lot of variety. And that variety is really important because I think in some ways it's the only way, at least it's the only way I know to be completely engaged with the narrative of art history and with the practice of making things. So anyway, but of course, one of Benjamin Bouckault's colleagues, Hal Foster, wrote a great article in October once called "The Archives of Modern Art," in which he talked about the way in which, as he described them, ambitious artists sort of are engaged with the narrative of the history of art, and the way in which you will be able to trace echoes of other works in the work that an artist does, not appropriations, not sort of copies of, but simply echoes of another work that demonstrate in some way that you've internalized the significance of, or the meaning of, or the value of that work, and that it becomes a part of the vocabulary of picture making that you use, but it never has to look like the thing that it's supposed to be an echo of to come here. But this is a painting I've been working on for a long while. And it's done now. But the thing is, like, so when I make works, there's always, this work is it's called London. It's called London Bridge because it is a picture of London Bridge. And there are a lot of things about that picture that matter that I didn't have to think about so much ahead of time, but that I was aware of all the while I was making the painting. And so everybody knows that the Chicago has a painting, the Seurat painting, Sunday on the Le Grand Jatte, that painting. But there are echoes of that painting all over this painting. And it's made in a way that sort of takes part in the spirit of picture making that Seurat used. I have a great book that I love called Seurat and the Science of Painting. And it echoes something that Marcel Duchamp had said about Seurat. He said, I like Seurat because Seurat makes paintings like a carpenter. Means that you build a picture out of ideas and out of structures and things like that. And the thing that's interesting about it is how sophisticated, how intricately you could actually construct the image. So anyway, but there's a lot I'm going to go through. But then stuff like this shows up and people say, well, what the heck? Like, what is he up to now? So he's gone from representation to abstraction. And my contention would be that this is not abstraction. That this is as much a representation as the previous painting is a representation. And it's a representation because it's built exactly the same way the previous painting was built. One shape at a time in relationship to another shape at a time. One color at a time in relationship to other colors at a time. It only appears to be abstract because it's a kind of representation of the phenomena of like an ink blot. So these are all blot paintings, but they are not made phenomenally like ink blots are made. So, and of course, that symmetry you get with an ink blot when you fold the paper in half and you end up with those two sides that are perfectly symmetrical. Well, this is not. This is a relative symmetry. It's a relative symmetry that's built one shape at a time so that there are spaces and there are gaps in the way in which the picture is constructed so that it's thought through in a much more complicated way than a standard blot or like you see a Warhol blot. I mean, it's complicated, much more complicated than those paintings are. And they're built, there's a system that allows you to build this kind of relative symmetry without giving away the fact that it's structured systematically. So there's a group of those. But when I look at that, that's not different from any of the other things that I have done because I think about it the same way while I'm working on it. It's not different than those. I mean, there's an anatomy for the blot paintings just like there's an anatomy for these kinds of paintings. These are some fairly recent works. And you can see in some of these that a part of what these pictures are about is I had a show at David's Rorner Gallery in 2014. The title of it was Look, See. They were about looking, about seeing, and about presenting a subject to be seen, to be looked at. And a subject that's sort of aware of itself, presenting itself to be looked at. But what you'll encounter in the work that I'm doing is that in every case, the work really is about being a picture. It's about what it means to be a picture, who's in a picture, what are they doing in a picture, do they know they're in a picture? I mean, that because my entire practice as an artist really is about what it means to be in a picture or not in a picture and what kind of picture you're in and how that picture operates, what that picture is meant to do, and what that picture's relationship to the history of painting is. So this was a companion piece to that barbershop painting. And you can see, so organizationally and in every other way, I mean, they're very different pictures. That first painting was called De-Style. which was a kind of play on a kind of linguistic figure in Black English, or what you call Ebonics, where you say D instead of the. And this style is, of course, you know. And that picture is sort of built on that sort of rectilinear kind of series of squares and things like that. And then this one, which has a kind of echo, a reference to the Holbein painting that's in London, the Ambassadors, with that anamorphic image down front. But anyway, and then you'll see in the work that I do, there's a way in which I am. So with all those first pictures, I consider myself largely like a history painter. And that's, so the scale of those pictures, the complexity of the narrative they articulate, all those things are kind of a reflection of this kind of historical notion of the seriousness of history paintings. So, and the scale, so those, like that previous painting, that thing was 13 feet across. So they're big pictures. Those blot paintings are 10 feet across, you know. But then I also, so the way in which I engage with history, and especially with African-American history, or Black history in America, is that there are people who have a presence in history, but many times there's no image that represents who they are. And then sometimes the image that represents who they are is either limited or compromised in one way or another. And so sometimes what I do is, with that absence in history, is to rectify the absence by creating an image that represents that figure. Now, in this case, there happens to be several photographs of this woman, Harriet Tubman, who everybody knows about, except one of the things that nobody ever really considers because of the way she's been fixed within history is that you never give Harriet Tubman her femininity. You never give Harriet Tubman her desirability. She's always seen as a symbol of the resistance to slavery because she was the conductor on the Underground Railroad. That is the narrative of Harriet Tubman. But that Tubman name is not her maiden name. She was married to a man named John Tubman. Nobody really talks about that. And so this is wedding portrait, Harriet and John Tubman wedding portrait. And so this was a chance to give back to Harriet Tubman within the narrative the kind of femininity and the aspect of desire that goes with having been chosen and married to somebody who was in love with you. So that expands the narrative of who she is in ways that we're not accustomed to thinking about her. And so that's something that I do. And I mean, and you could, I mean, if you really wanted to get sort of oblique and obscure about some things, I mean, there are echoes of the Arnold Feeney wedding in that picture, you know. So anyway, and then, well, of course, you know, there are all kinds of things that can be done, you know. It's like this notion that somehow when people who are interested in painting can't do anything but make paintings is tied to a notion that there's something somehow anti-intellectual about the practice of making paintings. And we know there's a dimension of the way in which we think about painting that's tied to a kind of emotional response to the world, in which the painting is the expressive consequence of an experience. And in those cases, you know, you will encounter artists who will make the claim that they cannot articulate to you what it was they were doing while they were doing it, or what it was they wanted in the act of beginning a picture or a project like that. That's not me. I simply reject any idea that there are mysteries that cannot be unfolded within the practice of making artworks. And part of that has to do with the fact that we know too much. We've seen too much. We've read too much. We know too much about what these things are and how they operate for us to claim, for anybody to make a claim that they have no idea what it is they are up to, and that they can't talk about it to other people because it's somehow so far beyond expression in language. I don't get that. I don't understand that. And so for me, everything is a project that's constructed to have a certain kind of effect. Everything is. And it's an opportunity to be engaged with the intellect of another person who is making something, which is what we do when we go to the museum or when we go to art galleries. That's all we want, is to be engaged with another intelligent person who did something that we can have a conversation about. Every one of these things has levels of specificity, some of which require a little bit of research on the part of the people who encounter it. Nothing is always given, although none of that material, none of the information there is unavailable or inaccessible. I mean, everybody who is there is named, all those pictures, and the fact that they are there and that they are named relates to a position in history they have. So, and that history spans all the way from the 19th century up to the 20th century. So all those figures are really important. And then once you start to decipher who those people are, then the configuration of the thing starts to make some kind of sense. Part of a show, I did a show at Vienna and the Secession that was titled, Who's Afraid of Red, Black, and Green? That was in part based on, of course, the Barnett Newman painting, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? But going beyond the sort of function of color field painting, so that you can demonstrate how you can have a kind of poetics and politics at the same time. This is one of the center. There were 3 paintings that are this size that were part of that show. They're all exactly the same size as the Barnett Newman painting. This is 8 feet by 18 feet. And it performs the same function that the Barnett Newman painting performs with a red field, but it's got a black zip and a green zip. But it's a text painting. It's not just a color field painting, but it does all the same things that the color field painting will do, and then it adds another dimension besides, and that other dimension is important. So what I did was dissect the painting. I made 3 paintings, each one privileged a different color in the red, black, and green field. So the black one, and it still played with those intervals that the zips kind of represent. I mean, all those things, but there's this other layer underneath. This absence, this question of absence is a recurring theme, and especially in the aesthetic domains in which the ways in which images connect with desire operate within the culture. And so this book I had from Taschen, The Great American Pinup, and it's got all the beautiful, titillating, images that the pinup represents, except, there's not a single black figure in the entire pantheon of that book. And then, then they made there's an elephant-sized version of that book, too, that's about this big. I have that one, too. And it is equally limited in terms of the kinds of images there. And that's not really, on one level, that's not problematic. Because it's like if you take in the way history has functioned, the way in which black people arrived in the Western Hemisphere, well, they weren't a part of a regime that was producing these kinds of products for their consumption. So it makes a lot of sense that they're not represented there. But as a citizen of a country or a culture, you are subject to the same kinds of influences that those kinds of images exert. And at some point, it becomes unsatisfactory to only have this as a model of what represents the beautiful. And then at that point, you have to do something about it, because you probably won't be able to convince somebody else to do something about it for you. So and where you have the capacity to generate these kinds of images yourself, then it's a responsibility to do so. Except you can't simply reiterate the same sort of functions of the image in its original condition. So my pinups, and this is a pinup, they do different things, you know, and they resist the objectification in a way that they are not an invitation to act out your fantasies about their acquisition in a way that the other images are designed to do. And so, but covering a lot of bases, not only from painting, but the comics. So all these things, and these are all places in which fantasies of power in superhero comics, fantasies of desire in pinups, the presence of figures in history. I mean, all these things are aspects of the history of art that are incredibly satisfying for me to a point. And the point at which I'm no longer satisfied is at the point at which I recognize that if I stay in the mainstream sort of mode of reading art history, then I will always be on the outside of it. And being outside is not a pleasant place to be. So I did a lot of painters. I'm interested in who paints, who paints, who paints, who paints, who paints. And the way in which these kinds of pictures, so you have those palettes, which are kind of an abstraction. You have the paint by number painting, which is a system for making representations. And then you have the fact that the painting in the paint by number painting is a representation of the painting that we're looking at, except the painter who's painting the painting is taking liberties with the system as it's structured. You know, you can do what you want, but you have to master the system. But, I love Fragonard's The Progress of Love. That cycle of paintings there at the Frick Museum in New York now. But, I love that stuff. Boucher, I confess, And the thing is, like, nobody is supposed to like that, but everybody does. And we know it. But these vignettes, they're fun to do. I love them. But they give you a chance to simply revel in the pleasure of paint at the same time that you're creating an image that performs a certain kind of way, and that you're engaged with the kind of history of painting that you're really appreciative of. One of the challenges in making paintings was that you always had to come up against the kind of barriers that led you towards kitsch. But I had this. So a part of what I do is I'm answering a question. I ask myself a question, then I try to answer the question with the work. So if there's a genre of work called black art. It's not work that ever shows up in a museum. It's work that you usually see on the street at street festivals and things like that. And they did an exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem once called Black Romantic. And that show was an open call to any of the artists who used to set up their stuff out on 125th Street to then be able to bring the work into the museum. But it was never work that was going to be curated into the museum by the curators there. And so I asked the question, if there's a problem with that work that doesn't allow it to engage in the kind of discursive activity that we who claim to be sort of in the sophisticated, advanced art world are part of, can you resolve that problem so that work can make its way into the institution? And one of the ways you begin to do that is to take the image they produce seriously and treat it as if it's such. And we know there are a series of devices that artists have been using at least since Duchamp. There are ways in which the art world works. There are certain kinds of devices you can use, and these devices are the things that transform artifacts that are outside the art world into artworks that can function within it. And they have reversals, you can do inversions, you can scale, shift, all those things. These are things you can do, Take a little thing, make it big. Take a hard thing, make it soft. Ask Claes Oldenburg. But it's that kind of thing. Do reversals on it, change the context. Take it from here and put it there, Those are all devices artists use to make things into artworks that hadn't previously been considered artworks. So these are artists who would love to be in the museum, but they are never invited to be there. They feel completely victimized by a system that privileges others and not them, and they don't know why. So somebody has to say, well, you know what? This is why. This is why. But it's not something you can't fix. That's the thing. The thing is it something you can fix, or is it something you can't fix? Are you trapped in the place that you are? Or is there something you can know and then something you can do that would transform what you have done and make it function in the place that you would like for it to function? That's the thing that's the key. So if we know anything, it has to be something that can be transmitted. And so there was an interview with Henry Louis Gates and John Berger was in Art in America magazine probably about 30 years ago, in which Skip Gates makes this comment that I think is really important. So one of the things, the contract with the university that we're engaged in is that the university as an entity exists because it claims that the things that are taught there, that you learn there, are not only knowable, but they are teachable. That's the contract we have with the university. If that's not the contract, there's no reason to be in the university. And so that's why I think so. It's like there's nothing mysterious about what it means to make art, really. And I say that in part because it's like we were talking about antiquities. Well, just like people were doing it in the Paleolithic era. I mean, they didn't have universities or academies to go to, but they were making stuff. They were making images. They were making objects. And those objects ultimately became the foundation of what we call art making now. We have different sets of ideas now. And the only thing that's different between what they did and what we do is that that the choices we make are limited by constraints that are imposed on it by philosophy and historical circumstance. But these are like these paintings. This is my response to Fra Angelico, the Annunciation paintings. And those are when I started making those in color and then started doing them in grisaille. That grisaille response is directly related to having an encounter with the Ang odalisque in grisaille at the Metropolitan Museum, where it really made me understand that the distance that the grisaille allowed you to create was more effective than the kind of presence that the color in the previous ones I was making kind of infused in the work. So, I mean, this is the way you sort of go to the museum and things still can happen, but the things that I do don't look anything at all like those works. These lynching photographs. So there's a famous lynching photograph that was taken in 1931 in Indiana, Marion, Indiana. It was a double lynching. And those photographs used to circulate as postcards in the United States. And it had been circulating as postcards for more than 100 years in the United States. And the thing is but the way in which images of this kind of lynching were treated before always focused on or privileged the body of the victim. But what they never really articulated was the culture that allows for that kind of violence to be persistent, and how the mechanism of that violence was transmitted generationally. And so in that photograph, so like there are three versions of the same photograph where the scene itself is reduced, and the only thing that's highlighted, there are three women in there, and those three women represent three different generations. This young girl who's only about 14, the woman in the middle who's about 20, and then the one on the end is about 20, and the other one's like a grandmother or something like that. So that generationally, and they are all there present as a part of the entertainment, effectively. And how also that some of the reasons why some of these lynchings took place had everything to do with protecting the virtue of these kinds of women, you know. And we had a short conversation about the Dana Schutz's Emmett Till painting. So it's like, and why is he dead? Because he whistled at a white woman. So when you really get to the heart of it, so the piece is a triptych. It's called Heirlooms and Accessories. And so the implications of all that, heirlooms and accessories, and how the kind of power that allows for that kind of violent dynamic to operate and to perpetuate itself is an inherited condition, and that everything that stems from it is inherited, and that in this case, it's like the perpetrators of these things were never brought to justice for it, you know. So anyway. But that's black man, photographs. Anyway, Barrett, I'm done.